Of information. I know you're all involved in the topic and working in the area of criminal justice reform. So I just want to give you a little bit of my perspective on that, talk a little bit about what some of the efforts have been in the state of Illinois to try to change Illinois sentencing structure and try to reduce Illinois' prison population.
Yeah, I want to mention that since he is modest and I'm not saying it, he was a member of the Illinois Commission on Justice Reform and Sentencing Reform. So, welcome.
Thanks. So I don't know if it was modest, or I just don't want to, shade people's view. It was a commission that was formed by Governor Rauner. Just by way of background, I've been working in the field for about 30 years. I previously worked for the state of Illinois. And about 20 years ago, I left the state of Illinois, and I've been at Loyola University as a full-time faculty member since then. I'm not political. I don't get involved in the politics part of criminal justice policy, and I think that's helped me to be involved and try to advance reform efforts, regardless of who's in power. I think one of the things I'm at least most proud of is I'm viewed as not a political person, that I'm a social scientist. I approach things from an empirical standpoint. I try to use research and science to guide policy and practice, and that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what some of the issues are with incarceration, and also the issues about really understanding what drives incarceration in the prison population, to make sure that you all understand some of the complexities behind it. Sometimes things that oftentimes elected officials offer up as the simple solutions to reducing prison populations isn't necessarily as simple and straightforward as they may make them out to be. And I'll talk a little bit about the politics of incarceration, the politics of prison, because I think that's something that drives a lot of the policy. It drives a lot of the resistance to some of the reform. A couple things I think are important to consider. One is to realize that we have a lot of goals that we seek in terms of the criminal justice system and how it operates, ranging from punishment and retribution to rehabilitation. And it's important to realize that we've gone through cycles of this, and we're kind of coming off a 30 or 40 year cycle of where punishment has really been the goal of the criminal justice system. The idea of rehabilitation as one of the primary goals has been largely absent from how the system is operated. And I think we're starting to see a turn in that. There's greater interest in rehabilitation. There's legislation from the federal government on down that is talking about reentry and second chances and things like that. So I think we're at a point in time where we're seeing the pendulum shift a little bit. And I'll offer up why I think we're seeing that pendulum shift. I think there's some interesting things driving this. The other thing to realize is the criminal justice system is extremely complicated. It's highly interconnected. So what one component of the system does, what one level of government does, impacts not only other levels of government and their work, but also other branches of government. So when we think about criminal justice reform, we've got to realize that there's not a single monolithic criminal justice system. The governor doesn't run the criminal justice system. When I talk to my students about criminal justice policy, I quickly make them realize that the President of the United States doesn't run the government of the United States, right? He doesn't run the state of Illinois or the city police department. So in a state like Illinois, there's about 800 local police departments. All of them have different constituencies and different priorities. There's 102 separately elected state's attorneys. And Kim Fox is the state's attorney here, but there's 101 other state's attorneys across the state, and they all have different priorities and goals. So realize that changing criminal justice practice is trying to change the behaviors of hundreds of agencies and thousands of staff. So it isn't something that's easy to accomplish in a short period of time. And I'll also talk a little bit about the costs of incarceration, because I think that's one of the primary things that's driving the desire for criminal justice reform at this point in time. It's the realization of how much money we're actually spending on we're now realizing is really just a system of punishment. It's not really a system of rehabilitation. And so we're investing a lot of money on the system that now is starting to compete with other priorities. So I think one of the big motivations for reform now is we're realizing the cost of this system and the cost of what we're spending on incarceration. So in Illinois, the cost to incarcerate someone in prison for a year is somewhere around $35,000 when you take into account the salaries of staff, the benefits of staff, retirement of staff. So it's an extremely expensive system, even for an individual person that's incarcerated. The other thing is we've seen a shift in the political winds. There's broad support for reform. So conservatives and Republicans are supportive of reform. Liberals and Democrats are supportive of reform, but oftentimes for different reasons. So a lot of the desire for reform on the more conservative side has to do with fiscal issues. It has to do with how much control government should have over people's lives. And the desire for reform on the Democratic or the more liberal side is the recognition of racial disparity in the system and how the justice system incarceration really has a disparate impact on the poor. So it's one of those unique times, at least in the last 40 or 50 years, where both sides of the aisle are interested in reform, but for very different reasons. The other thing that's pushing this change is a recognition of the drug laws and how punitive they've become. And so as I talk, I'm going to kind of weave in some of the things that came up during the Governor's Commission discussion that I think even for people on the commission, which represented people across the justice system and different parties and different perspectives, some of these things, as they reflected and looked back, they kind of realized that things had gotten out of whack in some respect with how we structured some of our laws. So the realization that being punitive with drug law violators is possibly the wrong approach is fueling it. Part of that also, I think, is the perception, the inaccurate perception that cannabis offenses, marijuana offenses, drive a lot of people's entry into the justice system and movement through the justice system. So a lot of people hear arguments about reforming our marijuana laws, and oftentimes the argument is if we make marijuana legal or decriminalize it, we'll see fewer people in prison. In Illinois, almost all offenses involving marijuana are misdemeanor offenses. You cannot legally be sentenced to prison for possession of marijuana. So realize that when elected officials say we're going to change our marijuana laws and we'll reduce the number of people in prison, that's really not going to happen. We don't send people to prison for those offenses. So, but I think that mindset, I think that in the public's mind, if they perceive that we're sending a lot of people to prison for possessing marijuana, they see that as an inappropriate use of prison, and that's behind some of the support for this. The other thing that I think is important is we're at a time now where nationally and in Illinois as a whole, crime is at a relatively low level. Despite the increase in homicides in Chicago in the last year or two, we're actually at a level of crime that's about a third of what it was in the late 80s and early 90s. So crime isn't the big issue nationally. It's clearly an issue specifically in Chicago because of the high homicide rate and the attention that it got during the presidential election. But crime in general and our response to crime in terms of getting tough really hasn't been the mantra like it was when I started my career in the 1980s, when we had record levels of violence and the response was seeking punitive solutions to that. The other desire for reform in prisons is the recognition that we send a lot of people to prison and most people come out of prison and continue their involvement in crime. So it's seen as not an effective response to crime in terms of reducing crime. Clearly effective in terms of punishment. No one who disagrees that going to prison is punishment. The research, though, is also pretty consistent that sending people to prison does not reduce their likelihood of involvement in crime, and it doesn't really have a deterrent effect on crime. So the historic argument that we need to use prison to deter crime empirically hasn't borne out. The empirical evidence suggests that isn't the way to reduce crime and particularly not a way to efficiently reduce crime in terms of how we use our resources. Let me talk a little bit about Illinois' prison population and kind of the patterns we've seen, and then I'll talk a little bit about what's been driving this and what ultimately needs to be done in terms of solving this. So I had a few graphs that I was going to show you to have a dramatic impact, so that you look and you're shocked. And I told my colleague here, Butter Jones, that the prison population is down in Illinois. So in the last 4 years, Illinois' prison population is down about 12%. When Governor Rauner formed the commission that I was on, he gave that commission the goal of developing strategies that will reduce Illinois' prison population by 25%. So one way you could look at it is we're halfway there. The other way to look at it is even if we reduce our prison population by 25%, we've got a prison population that's 3 times higher than it was in the 1970s. So it's interesting because a lot of people applauded the governor for actually having a goal. We want to have a prison system that has 25% fewer people in it. I think it was 25% by either 2020 or 2025. Year 2025.
Excuse me, you just said that the crime is down here, but the crime is down, the population is high.
Okay. So I'll get into that, and that gets into the challenges of how we reduce the prison population. So Illinois' prison population is down about 12% over the last 3 or 4 years. Just to give you, and I don't want to bore you with numbers or drown you in numbers, but just to give you some context, up until the early 1970s, there were fewer than 10,000 people in Illinois' prison system. In 2013, the prison population was almost at 50,000. It was almost at the point where they were literally going to run out of beds if something wasn't done. So if it's at 50,000, we reduce it by 25%, we're down around 38,000. Right? We're still a lot higher than we were in the 1970s. So in terms of kind of getting to your question, why is it if crime is going down, isn't the prison population dropping just as quickly? And what that gets into is some basic ideas that I want to explain to you about. I call it the math of prisons, or the math behind why prison populations go up or go down. There's basically 2 things that drive or influence a prison population. How many people are admitted to prison, and how long do they stay in prison, right? So if every year we admit 100 people to prison, and they all stay a year, right, and that was always the same, we'd always have 100 people in prison, right? 100 people would come in, 100 people would leave, but then we'd add another 100, right? The reason why prison populations grow is either because we admit more people to prison, or we keep them in prison longer, or what we've seen in Illinois and nationally is we do both. Mm-hmm. We send more people to prison, and we keep them in prison for a longer period of time. Right? So what happened in the 1980s and 1990s were a few things. One was crime actually was going up pretty dramatically. The early 90s, we saw the record homicide numbers in Chicago. I think in the early 90s, it was around 950 murders a year in Chicago. So when in recent years, Chicago had 500 homicides, that was a shock to a lot of people. It was a concern to a lot of people that we'd crossed that threshold of 500 murders. Because throughout much of the late 90s and 2000s, the number of homicides in Chicago was around 400 or something like that. Yeah.
Is there a different pattern today than there was in the 1990s in terms of murders? I mean, we hear about a lot of gang-related murders today. Was it similar then, or was it different?
Yeah, there was not getting too far off in the murders in Chicago, because that's another story. But one of the things that occurred in the late 90s or late 80s with this high level of homicides was the nature of homicides was very varied. Right? So homicides can involve domestic homicides and gang homicides and all these other forms of homicide. In the 90s, we developed a lot of policies and programs and strategies to address domestic violence. and the number of domestic homicides have dropped dramatically. What we never really developed a good way to address or control are gang homicides. So those are the types of homicides that tend to be very difficult to solve. The people who witness those oftentimes don't want to provide information about who they think the perpetrator might have been. They're very difficult to solve. So in the 80s, we saw relatively high clearance rates for homicide because when there was a homicide victim and the police came to the residence and there was a dead woman on the kitchen floor, and there had been a history of domestic violence calls to that house, the suspects were pretty easy to identify without the need for witnesses. And so those homicides were relatively easy to solve. What we're left with now, for the most part, are homicides that are much more difficult to solve. So the homicide clearance rate now is around 15 to 20% in Chicago, which means literally most people get away with murder if a murder is committed. There's a lot fewer of them now than there were 20 years ago, but they're much more difficult to solve. So to kind of get back to your question, in the late 80s, early 90s, we saw record levels of crime in Illinois and in Chicago. When you have more crime, you tend to have more arrests, and we had more serious crime, so we made arrests for more serious offenses. So we were admitting to prison more people for committing crime. At the same time, we also changed our strategy in response to drug law violations. And if you're familiar with the war on drugs or the wars on drugs we've had, many people describe that we probably had 6 or 7 wars on drugs starting in the early 1900s. I describe the war on drugs that started in the 1980s as really the first true war on drugs because we took a lot of prisoners. All the rhetoric about the war on drugs in the early 70s really didn't lead to a lot of changes in enforcement strategies and incarceration. But in the 1980s, we really did start to arrest and incarcerate people for violating the drug laws. And so in Chicago, as an example, arrests for felony drug offenses, which are pretty much all the drugs other than marijuana, quadrupled in a 2-year period. It wasn't because drug use quadrupled, it was because there was a shift in policy. There was an emphasis on enforcing the drug laws. And so President Reagan and the first President Bush got on TV and articulated that we need to crack down on drugs, we need to address this problem, and that rhetoric trickled down to the thousands of police departments and communities across the country, and the police chiefs responded to what their electorate demanded. Their electorate said, do something about the drug problem. And police have, at that point, saw themselves as having a few tools to respond to the drug problem. Their primary tool is we can arrest people. And we'll arrest people and we'll hand them over to the next component of the system and they'll process them through that system. I say that they didn't have a lot of tools then because currently the way that law enforcement is responding to the drug abuse problem isn't relying on arrests like it had in the past. There's a lot of programs now where police departments have created programs where if you're a substance abuser, you can come into the police department and ask to get treatment, and we will bring you to a treatment provider. There's a police department in Dixon, Illinois, that's getting a lot of recognition nationally because they've got a program where they've arranged with treatment providers that if we bring you an opiate abuser, will you admit them to treatment immediately? The late 80s, that never would have been thought of, right? The view then was the way we'll address this problem is through punishment and incarceration. Yeah.
I don't want to get off the subject, but that was more racially based. Is that correct?
The war on drugs,
yes.
if you will.
Because it's changing now. Because, like I said, it seems like Caucasian teenagers are using drugs.
Yeah, if you look at the large arc of how drug abuse and drug law violations have been handled, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, the view of a lot of white middle upper class college kids smoking pot was perceived as a problem, but not really a problem where we wanted to send all of them to prison. The way that the drug problem in the 80s was described was it was the crack cocaine epidemic, it was drug abuse by inner city minorities, and that was linked to violent crime, and it was linked to all sorts of perceptions about what that drug was and how we needed to respond to it. and you're correct. A lot of the arguments or perspectives now that opiate abuse and heroin overdoses is actually touching a different segment of the population. It's suggesting maybe we should respond differently. So there's many people who make that point that it wasn't.
From your research, you said you do the empirical research. What does it look like from the research perspective?
I mean, from the research perspective, I mean, if you look at who's been dying from heroin overdoses over the last 30 or 40 years, in the 80s and 90s, it tended to be more of an urban problem and involved minorities more often. The face of it looks differently now, literally. But it's difficult to say that it's the race of the person now. I mean, you could make that argument, that now that it's seen as affecting elderly people who are on pain medication, suburban white middle-class kids that are experimenting and overdosing, it's a change in our response. But you could also argue that it could be, we realized from our experiment, in quotes, in the 80s and 90s that locking people up for drug offenses isn't the way out, right? Or you can make the argument that it isn't the way out when the population looks very different. Right? So that is an issue, but this is all getting to your question about why is the prison population going up. So we arrested more people in the 80s and 90s, and at the same time we started to impose longer and longer sentences on people. So despite the fact that crime has been going down and arrests have been going down, Illinois' prison population really hasn't been going down that quickly. And primarily because we're keeping people in prison much longer when they're committing or being convicted of serious crimes.
When the sentences were lower, was the recidivism rate as high as it is now?
The recidivism rate has always been high, and all of the empirical evidence suggests that how long you keep someone in prison really has no effect on their likelihood of continuing into crime. The only caveat to that is that the two strongest predictors of recidivism is your criminal history, how often you've previously been involved in crime, and your age. So one way we can reduce recidivism is if we keep people in prison long enough, when they get out, they'll be so old that they'll be less inclined to commit crime. I'm not advocating that that's what we should do, because there's ways that we could reduce recidivism much more inexpensively than keeping people in prison until they're over 50 years old, right?
Have you taken into account the impact of mental health treatments after release and their impact on recidivism?
Yeah, the research on mental illness and crime, really the research says that there is no causal relationship between mental illness and crime. People who have a mental illness aren't any more or less likely to be involved in criminal activity. What we see in our prisons is a concentration of mentally ill individuals. They're not necessarily there exclusively because of their mental illness, but because of what their mental illness manifests itself in terms of behavior. So the research doesn't show that mental illness is a risk factor for offending or recidivism, but it certainly is a risk factor for the kinds of behaviors that are going to draw attention by the public. And that attention may then be translated into criminal behavior. So just to kind of illustrate the challenge with what drives prison populations, it's admissions and length of stay. So a colleague of mine who used to work for the Illinois Department of Corrections, he used to describe it as it's the long and short of prisons. Prison admissions are driven by people who come in large numbers and stay for short periods of time. Right? People who go to prison for drug possession, for example, account for a relatively large share of those going to prison, but they stay for a short period of time and then they're released. Right? So they drive admissions. The less serious, nonviolent crimes really drive admissions to prison. But what drives length of stay are people who commit serious crimes. They go in small numbers, but they don't leave for decades. Right? So I'll use the example of murder to illustrate that. On an annual basis, less than 1% of the people admitted to prison in Illinois are being admitted to prison because they've been convicted of murder. right? Fraction of admissions, right? 1 out of every 6 people in prison is serving a sentence for murder, right? So they come in small numbers, and they also leave in really small numbers, right? And part of that, what's driving that, is we've increased the length of stay for people convicted of murder from what in the 1970s was an average of about 10 years. So if you committed murder and went to prison in the 60s and 70s, you served about 10 years in prison, which is pretty consistent with what the length of stay in prison is in other countries if you commit murder. So if you commit murder in Sweden or Germany or other developed countries, you go to prison for about 10 years, which is what we did in the 60s and 70s. We increasingly ratcheted up our sentencing. In the 80s and 90s, it was about 20 years. And currently, if you go to prison for murder, the average amount of time you're expected to spend in prison is around 45 years. Right? So even if we reduced our admissions dramatically, right, we're going to have this buildup in the population of people serving these extremely long sentences. Right? Yes.
Are any of the sentencing reform proposals on the table or that have been proposed by the commission, any of them involve reducing the sentences of those who are already in prison?
So I'll talk a little bit about the reforms as it relates to just long and short of it, right? So one set of recommendations that the commission made really had to do with these less serious offenses, for which going to prison is an expensive endeavor. It really doesn't produce any kind of impact on recidivism. People are in prison too short of a period of time to actually access rehabilitative services. And so there's a lot of suggestion that that population isn't really well served by going to prison. So one of the sets of recommendations we made was to reduce the minimum sentence that's allowed to be imposed for those people who go to prison. Because one of the things we saw with people who go to prison for drug law violations is the sentence that's imposed by the court tends to be at the absolute minimum for what is legally allowable. So as an example, if you are convicted of a Class 1 felony in Illinois, what that would be is if you possessed $1,000 worth of cocaine and you were convicted of that, you would have to be sentenced to prison. It's a mandatory prison sentence. And the prison sentence would have to be somewhere between 5 and 15 years. Right? That's what the law says the prison sentence has to be. And in the research we did for the commission, we found that almost all the sentences imposed on those individuals was at that minimum. Right? In other words, the judge had to impose a prison sentence, but what they opted for was the absolute minimum. So one of the commission recommendations was make all the minimum sentences 1 year, regardless of the felony class of the offense, and give judges the latitude that if they feel a shorter sentence is appropriate, they can do it. What that would do is it would reduce the length of stay for those people who are going in and out of prison very often. Another one of the recommendations was to make the possession of small amounts of drugs other than marijuana a misdemeanor offense, meaning that under the law you could not be sentenced to prison for that. Recommendations about making retail theft a misdemeanor. So there were a number of recommendations that said take some of these less serious crimes and make them ineligible for prison, make them a misdemeanor offense. At the other end of the continuum, we did try to make some recommendations that dealt with this other part, the long of it. What do we do to reduce the length of stay of people in prison who are there for an extremely long period of time? That's where it gets a little bit more challenging, and that's why, and one of the things I wanted to the point I wanted to make to you is reducing the prison population substantially ultimately means we've got to reduce how long people are in prison who commit the most serious crimes. And politically, that's a challenge. The idea that we should shorten the length of stay in prison for people who commit murder and rape and armed robbery is difficult to sell politically. Right? Imagine what the opposition ads would be if a member of the General Assembly voted for a law that said people who commit murder shouldn't go to prison for so long. It'd be challenging. dealing with sentences on sex offenders is extremely different from a political standpoint. But to truly reduce the prison population, there's got to be some effort to address that. So one of the recommendations of the commission, which was relatively modest, was under Illinois law, if you're sentenced to prison for murder, by law you have to serve 100% of that sentence. So if the judge sentences you to 40 years, you have to be in prison for 40 years. You're not allowed to earn any time off that sentence by good behavior or participation in programs. So one of the recommendations of the commission was allow inmates who are sentenced under truth in sentencing to earn some of that time off their sentence. So instead of a 40-year sentence, allow them to earn at least 10% of that off their sentence, which would be 4 years less in prison. Not dramatic, but when you add up the 1 out of every 6 people in prison for murder, it's a pretty large number. The challenge is, what do you do with people who are currently serving a sentence? Do you allow the law to retroactively apply to them? And that's one of the areas where, given that I'm not an attorney, I can't fully answer it, but I'll describe what I've seen as the political effort of trying to do this. There have been a number of proposals that have been suggested or offered that would say, if you're at least 50 years old and you've served at least 20 years of a sentence, right, you would be eligible to go back before a judge and have them reconsider your sentence. Right? In other words, you're old enough to where you're a lower risk of recidivism, you served a substantial portion of your sentence. The challenge with that is ultimately somebody still has to make a decision. An elected official, an elected judge, an elected state's attorney would have to make a decision as to whether or not this person who committed a serious crime should be resentenced and given a lower sentence. And so efforts to implement that haven't passed. And in states where they have created these, rarely is it used, because what essentially happens is the case goes back before the court and the prosecutor argues that this person served 20 years. They committed a serious murder. Here's the grisly details of that murder. They were sentenced to 50 years. They've only served 20, right? And so anything to try to retroactively address these long sentences is different both operationally in terms of how it would be carried out, but also politically, because the idea of doing anything dealing with the most serious offenses in terms of reducing sentences is a challenge. The commission at one point, when we were meeting, we were talking about reconsidering some of the laws that relate to the use of a firearm in the commission of a crime. So under Illinois law, if you possess a firearm when you commit a crime, it's an automatic, I think, an extra 10 years to your sentence. If you display the gun, it's an automatic 15-year enhancement. If you use the gun, it's an automatic 25-year enhancement.
And that would apply in all cases to anybody in the car if one person shoots.
Now, generally, there's some laws that apply. Even with that issue, we saw it as if you commit armed robbery with a firearm, under the law historically, the sentence was anywhere from 6 to 30 years. Under this, the minimum would be the 6 years plus the 15 years, so the minimum would be 21 years. When we started to debate that policy within the commission, put it in the context of when our commission was at the point of considering final recommendations, and it was at the height of the violence in Chicago, the shootings, legislation being introduced in the General Assembly to increase the penalties for people who possess a gun. So there was no will among the commission members, most of whom were elected officials. They were members of the General Assembly. To, on one hand, be making recommendations about reducing the penalties on people who use a gun in the commission of a crime, given the optics of what was going on. And the legislation was being introduced at the time to say we need to get tougher on these individuals, not less punitive.
You know, it seems to me that it's just this history repeating itself. Now we're getting tough on gun crimes as opposed to now no longer tough on drugs.
Right.
And so I was just in Stateville, I promise you, less than three weeks ago. And it seemed like every one of the African American young kids were there for gun crimes. And I'm hearing about the trains that are stopping right here in South Chicago, where they're just going there looting these trains and getting all these guns. Almost like it is being perpetrated by some hidden hand. And now the legislature said, if we see a gun involved in it, let's give them the max. Even if they pull the trigger, I think they get extra years if there's a bullet in the chamber, how many. Come on, man, some of this stuff. That's why we exist, so that we can at least say this is fundamentally, it's not protecting the public, it's not doing what, I was reading the what do you call that, the mission of the Illinois Department of Correction, and it's almost like that's not what they're there for. It's not helping the public, it's not providing safety. And we get on the Channel 7 News at night, and we show somebody got jumped on here and murdered there, and we turn it to all this chaos and just locking up folks.
I think, your point, and really why I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to people like you are members of the community that are interested in learning about things and being involved, is a lot of times these policies are passed and implemented to appease an electorate that thinks that's the solution, right? So, State Senator Raul, who sponsored and promoted the legislation for the enhanced penalties on the gun offenses, an African American senator from this community, the expectation was you need to do something about this problem, and you need to do it quick. And unfortunately, crime problems generally aren't solved quickly, right? So we can pass legislation quickly. With the war on drugs, it was a race to see who could come up with the most creative, punitive law, because those you could implement, or you could debate and pass within a few months, and show your electorate, look, I've done things to address the problem. The idea that will have a substantial impact on the violence problem, the empirical evidence suggests that it likely won't.
It's not. Just being there, man, just a lot of those young kids now, this explosion of, they're taking Percocets and Xanax, and it's not even gang, drug related anymore. I'm talking to these young guys, and it's just, this is my set, this is my block, these are my 6 homies, and we just go across the bridge after we get high and just kill each other because we're on Facebook. These are Facebook, come on, like social media is part of this. And so I think that if we're gonna make policy, it has to be comprehensive enough that it looks at all of these things and say that even though a young guy had a gun and he was not in the commission of a crime, got stopped and pulled over before it ever happened, what do we do to make sure that he doesn't kill anybody but not take away his whole life in prison? And I think that as believers, Christians, or this Unitarian, we're here for justice and social justice, to say that, hey, I made mistakes when I was 18. Some other folks have done some things that they didn't get punished for. They were shown mercy, or they didn't get caught. So we need to take all of those into consideration.
And the challenge with people who are charged with illegal possession of a firearm, murder, when you look at their age, they tend to be young adults, right? So there's an area in psychology about brain development. It's recognizing that full cognitive development doesn't finish until about 25 years old. So the idea that legally at 18 you're an adult and you face adult consequences for your behavior, cognitively you're not an adult. You're impulsive, you take a lot of risk, you do stupid things with your friends. But if you commit a murder in Illinois with a firearm, you will be in prison until you're 60 or 65 years old because of the impulsive things you did as a developing adult, not a fully, developed cognitive adult. And I think that's where the biggest issue is that the people that are involved in some of the most serious behavior are at an age where, I'm not saying we should give them a pass, but we have to realize that for many of them, that means essentially a life sentence. You know, by the time they got out of prison when they're 65, 3/4 of their life would have been in the State-Filled Correctional Center, which doesn't make for a good prospect when they get out, right?
And then we have to keep looking at the fact that most of these folks are brown, African American, or Hispanic, and so that's another thing. We have to look at it at a deeper level.
Are we in that long period now? We're going to go let him sum up and then really throw it open.
Yeah.
Right, I'll just make a couple more points, and then I'm happy to have some more conversation. So I think that's the challenge, is to really reduce the prison population substantially. There's got to be something done to shorten lengths of stay for the most serious crimes, but politically that's going to be the most challenging. Realize also that we've got 1 out of every 6 or 7 people in prison for murder. And in Chicago, only 20% of the murders are solved, right? So realize what the prison population would be like if the Chicago police actually was able to solve twice as many of the homicides that occur. So it's not, it's almost a foreboding thing. I think people would like that people who commit murder be held accountable. But where we're at is the amount of accountability we're placing on them and the cost that that's imposing on us. That's why we're at this point where we've got to figure out how do we reduce our expenditures. The one thing that is driving the decrease we've seen in the prison population is we've really changed our approach to how we view drugs and what drug enforcement looks like. So in the city of Chicago, drug arrests for felony drug offenses are down about 80% in the last decade. The police departments changed how they approach drug enforcement. They don't do it like they used to. Because of that, admissions to prison are down a lot in Illinois. A lot of it, and this is where it gets interesting because you can actually drill down, half of the decrease in arrests in Chicago is from 3 specific neighborhoods. Right? So it's a change in policy in 3 specific neighborhoods about drug enforcement that's driving a lot of the decrease in admissions to Illinois prisons. Right? Which goes to show you that if the public loses its taste for some of these punitive approaches or responses, like we lost our taste for the enforcement of drug laws like we did in the 80s and 90s, that elected officials respond, right? The police department says, this isn't what the public wants. This isn't what they like seeing. They don't like seeing black and brown people arrested for these offenses and in the Cook County Jail and in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Let's change our strategy. Let's change our approach. So there are some positive things that illustrate that the justice system can be responsive to what the public wants. But what's difficult is, can they undo what they've done in the past with respect to how violent crimes are treated and what to do with those people who are currently in prison, who are looking at being there for the next 20 or 30 years? Is the public willing to say, we want to see those people released sooner, or we want to change our laws as it relates to murder and crimes with a firearm and things like that? And that's where there's still a lot of political difficulty in achieving that. So.
You mentioned you were going to address something about the costs. I assume the monetary costs, the cost of society of mass incarceration for different types of offenses. Yeah.
So I think with cost, one of the important things to realize is when we spend the roughly $38,000 a year to keep someone in prison for a year, that money's not being spent on highly effective, clinically based therapeutic interventions. Right? The money's being spent to hire correctional officers to oversee inmates, provide the inmates with food, clothing, and basic amenities. So what we get for $38,000 is punishment. Right?
Disability.
And disability and whatever medical needs they may have in prison. So a lot of people look at how much we spend on prisons and say, clearly the prison inmates aren't taking advantage of all the services and programs that are being offered. Because if we're spending that much money, we should be getting a better return on our investment in terms of reduced recidivism. The money's not being spent for that. As you saw, Butter Jones was at a facility in Illinois that actually does offer a therapeutic program that's clinically based and and highly rigorous. And it serves about 800 inmates out of the 50,000 inmates in the prison system. So there's very few services available. Part of the goal of the reduction in the prison population is with fewer people in prison, ideally that money could be used to provide the kinds of therapeutic interventions that the people that do need to be incarcerated for public safety can access services and be rehabilitated. The other way to look at it, and there's a group in New York that's done this, if there's 27 people in prison for a year, that costs $1 million, just to kind of put that math into perspective. So in New York City, they actually mapped out neighborhoods where there were at least 27 people from that neighborhood in prison, and they called them the $1 million blocks. $1 million was being spent to incarcerate people from that neighborhood. And one thing to realize about the spending on prisons is oftentimes it's portrayed as we're spending the money to protect that community. But realize the money we're spending to incarcerate the people from that community isn't being spent in that community. It's being spent in, for the most part, rural parts of Illinois where the prisons operate. And the money to pay for those prisons is coming from the areas that generate the tax revenue. So I kind of describe it as like a triangle of money. You know, the money to fund prisons primarily comes from the suburban communities where the tax base is higher. It's used to incarcerate people from primarily neighborhoods in Chicago. And the money's then spent in southern Illinois. And so what we have now, and one of the challenges about reducing the use of prison, is there are towns and communities in Illinois that are now dependent on prisons to serve as their economic engine. And I always use a quote that Governor Quinn had when there was a point in time where they're trying to close one of Illinois' oldest prisons. Pontiac Correctional Center is one of the maximum security prisons in the state. It was opened in 1870, so it's going on about 150 years old, extremely old, and they wanted to close that prison. And I'll read you the quote from Governor Quinn when he decided that they should not close the prison. He said, "Keeping Pontiac Correctional Center open will ensure nearly 600 people in the region keep their jobs, prevent hundreds of families from being uprooted, and allow Pontiac to maintain one of its largest sources of revenue." So that's a quote from the press release that he issued when he made the decision to keep the prison open. The decision is another step in Governor Quinn's efforts to ensure greater fiscal responsibility in state government. The prison provides nearly 600 jobs and generates approximately $54 million in revenue for the region. And so, again,
For how many prisoners? Approximately.
About 2,000 inmates are at that facility, or at least when I pulled this information, there are about 2,000 inmates at that facility. But I'm not saying it for a political statement, and it's nothing about Governor Quinn in particular, but part of the issue is that prisons now are part of the economic system within communities. And I make the link to the debates about bringing back coal country and the idea that we need to revive the coal industry. Many people would describe the coal industry and coal as a source of energy as a dated way of thinking, right? It's an inefficient source of energy. And a lot of people now are realizing that prisons are inefficient and ineffective response to crime.
I'd like to shift the conversation for a minute and talk about perceptions of crime and deterrence. I mean, prisons are certainly do incapacitate and keep people away, and they also presumably are presumed to rehabilitate, which they don't.
Right.
You know, what's interesting is that the incidence of incarceration is changing dramatically. The rates of incarceration are higher in the countryside and in Appalachia than they are in cities now. And the numbers of opiate deaths likewise have shifted from the cities to the countryside. And I'm wondering if that's going to affect the way people look at crime and the kinds of either punishments or deterrents that they look
Yeah.
for.
I think your point about how we've changed our view of drugs and drug abuse is right on point. I think that, like I said, it's either two things. It's that we said that effort at reducing substance abuse through punishment and incarceration didn't work, and we need to shift our approach, and that's what we're doing now with the opiate epidemic. Or it's now that it's affecting a different population, we need to rethink this. You know, with methamphetamine, that was a drug primarily in rural areas, and we did see an increase in admissions to prison from rural communities for methamphetamine production and possession. Part of it is that crime is becoming a little bit more dispersed from the city, you know. So crime is spreading or changing a little bit, and that may change people's reaction to it. But I think your point about perception is important. Is what does the public perceive the crime problem to be?
And also, I mean, the people, the companies who are making money out of the prison, keeping, you know, kids or people there for longer because they want to benefit from. That is bigger crime than the petty crimes that, you know, those drug dealers.
The one, you know, I won't be argumentative, but I'll respond in this way, that in Illinois there are no private prisons. So in Illinois there's no private company that's running prisons and making money off prisons. But prisons certainly do provide jobs, and they provide political influence, and they're important, I'll use air quotes to say, assets for communities. There are communities that want prisons in their community. They will...
But then who is benefiting from, when you say that they want to keep them longer because of the more revenue, who is benefiting from that? The government?
The people who benefit the most from prisons are people in communities where the agricultural economy has shifted such that the idea of having a family farm and making a decent living is now difficult to do. But with a high school diploma, you can get a job working in a correctional facility and make more money than you ever would without that facility, with good benefits and a good retirement package and things like that. So the people that are benefiting most are people who are living in those communities, who want to stay in those communities. They don't want to live in a big city. They want to live...
Yeah, but those people have no power. Those who are keeping the prison running, those people have the power. You know, and a clerk or somebody, a guard, they don't have much power. They just go there and work. They would not be keeping the prison running.
Collectively, though, all those correctional officers and employees make up a large number of people who vote. They're members of a union that have political influence. In California, one of the strongest organizations is the California Correctional Officers Association. In California, they were the ones that lobbied for changes in the state's laws that led to the 3 strikes law in California and things like that. So realize there's power in those large numbers. There's loyalty that those officers and those employees place with elected officials who ensure that their jobs remain. Pontiac staying open benefited the legislators that lived in that or were from that community. And closing prisons, there have been examples of that where that's been used as political payback for legislators that won't go along with the program. We'll close the prison in your community, and we'll blame you for the closure of that prison, and the next time that you're up for election, your constituency will not like the fact that you led to the closure of that large employer in the community.
Yeah. Now, when the focus was on stiff enforcement of drug laws, a lot of arrests and so forth, that could be attacked, you know, through statistics, and people could get enraged and fight that because they realize that there's this big disparity between the sentencing for just powder cocaine versus crack cocaine, for example, and that even for when you had similar usage among different different racial groups and so forth, you were having a more concentrated enforcement in communities of color. You were having of those who got arrested, more got imprisoned and so forth. You had all kinds of statistics that showed there was a racial, if you want to call it bias or systemic racism that, you know, you can see in statistics. With regard to the newer focus on shifting to tougher gun laws and enforcing those as compared to enforcing drug laws, do we have yet statistics to show whether there is a racial bias in enforcement? So, like to say that all the enforcement is being concentrated in communities of color, or that of the arrests for people who have, let's say, you know, gun possession, they didn't use it, but let's say, whatever it is, a similar crime, you know, just possession of a gun, that there's a racial inequality in the sentencing or anything like that. So I'm just asking if there are yet statistics yet, or is it too new to have those statistics yet?
I think the challenge, and I try to present things to help people understand what the challenge is from both a political standpoint, but also an operational standpoint. So you know, where do we want the most police concentrated? Where should there be the most police? Most people would argue they should be in the communities where there's the most crime, right? So they put the police in the communities where there's the most crime, based on people calling the police and saying a crime's been committed. Right? So we've got higher concentrations of police in poor minority communities because of that, right? And the police are there patrolling, and they're more likely to see illegal activity and respond to crime, right? Do you agree with me, or
I agree that part of it is because there's more calls, but I'm just saying. So you can say that there's more police, so they're more likely to arrest people. But there can also be, you know, by police administrations, you can say, well, you know, we want to get the guns off the street. We're going to focus our, you know, forces in certain areas to, you know, to get the guns out of these communities. So you might say that they're having a racial bias in doing that. You might say, oh, no, it's just because that's where the shootings are. But you can argue it different ways. But I'm just trying to ask, and of people, again, who are arrested with, whether, you know, using a gun or just possessing a gun or whatever the category is, whether there was any racial bias in the sentencing. I was just wondering if that, if stats are available yet.
I wouldn't say there's racial bias in. I mean, look, with the example of a felon in possession of a firearm. All right, if you're a felon in possession of a firearm, the law says that you have to be sentenced to prison. It's a mandatory prison sentence. If the majority of people who are arrested and prosecuted for that offense are African American, is that disparity? Is it a disparity if the people that are apprehended for committing the crime are more likely to be African American? What we'll never know is, do the police ignore and look the other way when they see a Caucasian with a gun, right? If there was a way to look at that, then you might be able to say, hey, there's some bias. And that's with the example you gave of drug use. We actually have independent studies that measure the prevalence of drug use. So we know that drug use among whites and blacks is relatively equal. But there's differences in arrest patterns, right?
Yeah.
And so the question is there a difference in arrest patterns because the police focus on the drug use of minorities? Or is it that the police are highly concentrated in minority communities because that's where they're deployed, because that's where the crime is, and because they're there, they're more likely to come across people possessing drugs or selling drugs. If they're not highly concentrated on Michigan Avenue, right, they're not going to find people on Michigan Avenue using drugs. But the political challenge is, if we said, let's put more cops on Michigan Avenue and have them looking for drugs, I could imagine a lot of communities saying, why are you putting all the police on Michigan Avenue? Why aren't you putting the police in the communities where there's the crime? So it's that kind of double-edged sword that we put the resources where the crime is perceived to be based on calls to the police. And when the police are out patrolling in those communities and they see illegal activity, it's more likely to be committed by the people living in that community or minorities.
Okay, Finley?
I'd like to make 3 points, 2 points in the question. Following off of Alan's attempt to try to figure this out, the concept which I have based a great deal of my theology and ideology, the concept of neo-racism. For example, in many black communities, you will see a sign we call police. So right there you establish that those communities are in relationship to the police. They're already established. This is our mode of dealing with any untoward situation. They put it in their windows, and these tend to be more middle class, upper middle class areas. Those kind of areas where you have a friendly relation with the police, with the CAPS, with the beat patrol, all of that kind of good stuff, they tend not to have the kind of high incident arrest records, except for people who wander into those communities. People from the community itself, they know the policemen, they go to the CAP meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore, in the theory of neo-racism is that a guy like Raul, he is reflecting the law and order ideology of certain segments of the African American community that want the drug houses closed down, these people wearing their pants below their knees, picked up, and definitely don't want to have many people carrying guns and pistols in our neighborhood. So there is a class dimension to the racism that is no longer like it was in the days of segregation. That's one thing I like to bring out about that new racism part. The second part is there is an economic dimension beyond whether you have a private or public prison. If you were to put a prison in this area, now we'll draw some line. Here's a line that goes to whoever's controlling the telephone company connection. And there's a line that goes there to the construction company. There's a line there to those who supply the groceries and other facilities to make the thing work. There's a line there to those who supply the uniforms that they get into the prison system itself. In other words, there's a spoke effect economically beyond the prison as a public institution, not just a prison Corporation of America type of prison, but even in a so-called government-run prison, there are links to the other capitalists out there who benefit greatly from the secondary wave of economic energy that is generated. And they don't also want to see this lost. It's not just some union guys or some clerks and so forth. There's a whole telephone multi-million-dollar operation that's private that's connected to the public prison system. So we got to always kind of, backtrack a little bit and take an overview why these prisons are so economically viable. And my third point is this question. I read a study somewhere, maybe you know about it in more detail, where a great deal of the back and forth on who goes to jail and how long they stay is prosecution driven. That prosecutors, and the model they presented in this article I read was from Florida. There's a prosecutors association, and their job is to try to get as many people in jail, black or white, who are poor, have no general representation, and but because of the traditional racism, tend to be black and white, but white people are certainly brought up into it, that they are somehow a part of the force that keeps that tension you describe of long-term, short-term. They're the ones who don't want people to come out. They're the ones who almost in collaboration with the forces of hard-heartedness, cruelty of brain, uncompassionate. And that the prosecution union, if such an animal exists, is, according to this article, the driving force behind this hard-hearted approach. Not so much mean-spirited electorates who don't know one way or another what the hell is happening. They just go to television, watch football games, etc., unless there's a murder in their neighborhood. So those first 2 points, one about the theory of neo-racism that explains some of these disparities and also the role of a guy like my good friend Raul. Number 2, the economic benefits beyond the unions and the ASME folks that make their money. And the question of, is a lot of this stuff prosecution driven? Any statistics on that?
Yeah, there's a good book, but it's dense. It's called Governing Through Crime, and it was written by someone who really traced how we've seen government govern people through crime, and it's a good historical trace back to the 1960s when crime really became a good political approach. Nixon with Law and Order,
Mitchell.
And so it documents all of the evolution from more of a judicial role to increasingly the prosecutor becoming the one who drives the bus, so to speak.
Is that the FAF book?
Pardon me?
The author is?
Simon is the last name, Governing Through Crime. But the what we've seen now is the prosecutors decide which cases are going to enter the system. Right? They're the ones that review a police report and say, we're taking this one, we're filing charges, this one we're not going to file charges. Almost all cases in the criminal justice system are plea bargains, so there's very few trials, and the plea bargain is driven by what the prosecutor is willing to offer up. So one of the things we've seen is increasingly the more punitive laws, the 3 strikes laws, the mandatory prison sentences, really puts a prosecutor in the driver's seat. Because in Illinois, if you're charged with residential burglary and convicted of it, it's a mandatory prison sentence, right? But whether or not you're charged with residential burglary or criminal trespass, that's up to the prosecutor to decide. And they'll decide that depending on your criminal history, your willingness to plead guilty, and perhaps some other characteristics about the defendant, right? And so your point's a good one, and that's that the prosecutors really control a lot. And the way we've set up our criminal sentencing structure, increasingly they have even more control than they had in the past. There used to be, with residential burglary, it used to be that the judge could decide, or it was a probationable offense. And that was actually one of the recommendations of the Governor's Commission for that crime, for example. Why is it that the law says that anyone convicted of that should be sentenced to prison? It didn't make sense. And I use the example for my students. If you go into your neighbor's garage and the garage is attached to the house and you steal beer out of their refrigerator and you're 18 years old and you're convicted of that offense, it's a mandatory prison sentence. And all the students get shocked. And I said, do you think you'd end up in prison? And they're looking at me trying to figure out what I'm going to say. I said, well, if you're 18 and you've never done that before, hopefully the prosecutor would allow you to plead guilty to something lesser, right? But the prosecutors become increasingly important. There's a chapter in the book I referenced called Prosecutor in Chief, because they describe how we've elected presidents over the last 40 or 50 years. That either, if you hear some of the mayor's speeches, the mayor of Chicago, he sounds like a prosecutor, right? So this idea we've got to convict these people, we've got to hold them accountable, right? That's the role of the prosecutor. But a lot of people use that language to articulate that we are the ones here for the victim, we're the ones to hold people accountable, and that's why they're extremely powerful. Your point about there being a prosecutors union, there's not a union, but there's an Illinois State's Attorneys Association that's extremely influential in the General Assembly. They lobby for changes in policy that give the prosecutors the ability to have more control over the process.
Yeah, I just want to kind of confirm what Mr. Finley was saying about just all of those folks, everyone who's getting fed by this criminal justice system. While I was there in Stateville, I'm a diabetic, and so I had to go to a diabetic line twice a day. And I noticed that all of the medication had one provider on all of the pills and all of the syringes that were used. And so that particular, whatever that medical provider is, it's all of the contract. You didn't have like 3 of them. I don't know if it's any competition involved, but and so if they're doing that in one prison, it might be like that throughout the whole state. So yeah, so those folks, everybody is getting paid. Evan tried to send me some envelopes. They couldn't even let me have the envelopes because they sell envelopes on the commissary, and so if your people are sending you envelopes and you're not buying it, somebody's losing money off you're not being able to spend money on the commissary. So everybody is, getting paid.
There's, to your point, there's a lot of money being spent on the system, but generally about 3/4 of that money is spent on personnel. So it's spent on the staff that are working there. But 3/4 of the money means there's a quarter that's spent on other things. And in Illinois, the prison budget's somewhere over $1 billion. That's $250 million. That's some of it's going for the healthcare provider, some of it's going for the drug treatment provider, some of it's going for the envelopes and all those other things. So there's certainly a lot of money involved in the system.
Well, that's what I was saying. Some big people are making money, not the little guys there.
Could you comment briefly on the role of the public defender in Illinois and whether it has that been studied at all? And does it vary widely from county to county, apart from the lack of resources, the level of collaboration with the prosecutor and the level of real adversarial approach on behalf of prisoners?
Yeah,
Or accused
it's
people.
supposed to be an adversarial system, so that the prosecution and defense attorney should be adversaries, right? They should be, trying to argue their side of the case, and ultimately both are seeking justice. It gets, again, to what the public wants to support and what the public perceives. So oftentimes the public isn't thrilled with the idea of tax dollars going to pay to, in quote, get criminals off. Because that's oftentimes what people see the role of public defenders, that they're there to get the guilty people free. Well, they're there really to ensure that the way we've set up our justice system has some semblance of fairness and balance. So you do have issues of public defenders' offices being understaffed, losing staff, and having a difficult time kind of meeting the needs of the clients they serve. So I think that's something that has for a long time been seen as a great imbalance, that the prosecution has essentially all the resources of the state. They've got the police doing investigations, they've got a lot of support to make their case. Public defenders, particularly in the public's view, isn't an investment that the public sees as important. But hopefully with the recognition of when you don't have a robust defense, we end up with wrongful convictions and large settlements paid to people who've been wrongfully convicted. Realize that if we skimp on defense, we end up paying for it either in these settlements, or we pay for it because we realize that people have been treated unfairly, and the system loses its credibility if people perceive that.
Let me ask another question, because this was something I experienced when I was there too. Parole violators. You've been charged with a crime, you've not been convicted of a crime. Mm-hmm. But if, like 100% of those folks who went from Cook County were violated, and so they had to actually serve out their parole even before they actually went to court for the crime that they've been charged with. Right. And so one of the young men told me that that's not the case throughout the system. So you might come from, say, a DeKalb County, and they may not violate you. But if you're from Cook County, most of those folks are violated, and they have to serve out the remainder of that time that they're on parole, even prior to being charged or convicted of the crime. So if they win the case, they've still spent time for, a crime that they didn't get convicted of.
Right. So when you're released from prison, you're on a period of supervision. That's called mandatory supervised release. One of the conditions of your supervision is that you not get arrested for a crime. If you get arrested for a crime, you violated the conditions of your release. In some jurisdictions, they'll put that case through at least some preliminary hearings to determine if there's sufficient evidence that a crime was committed. But it's so there's one thing you raised is that we do return people to prison as parole violators for crimes that they've been accused of, but they have not yet been convicted of.
Exactly.
And if that case were to actually go to trial, it might be a pretty weak case, right? So one of the policies that's in place in Illinois is if you're on parole and you get arrested for domestic battery, the Illinois law says you have to have your parole revoked, that the parole agent is required under law to issue a revocation of parole if you're arrested for domestic battery. And domestic battery is a serious crime, and we need to respond to it in ways that reduce its occurrence. But research suggests that mandatory arrest and those types of responses aren't necessarily going to reduce it. A therapeutic intervention would be more likely to address it. And research also shows that those are the cases that are least likely to matriculate through the system. Oftentimes the victim does not want it to result in a prosecution and conviction.
Exactly. So now your girlfriend gets mad with you one night and she
right.
calls the police and you're going to jail.
Right. Or what's potentially even worse is you're the victim of domestic battery and you don't call the police because you don't want the person returned to prison. And if that occurs, then there's domestic violence that's occurring, and we as a system or we as a government can't do something to intervene, like provide that victim with access to shelter, provide that victim with support so that they can get out of that abusive environment, or provide the services to the offender so that they stop engaging in that behavior. And so there's some interesting patterns with, and it gets down to what police do too. If the police pull you over and they know you're on parole, they know that an arrest may result in a revocation, and they may treat you differently knowing that you're on parole than had they stopped you and you're no longer on parole, because they see it as, okay.
And if you're black on parole, they may treat you differently too.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And then they're gonna ask you, if you can show us where a gun is, if you can tell us where a drug spot is, we'll let you go. And they actually do that. I can't fathom all of the stuff that's going on within our system, and we call it justice, criminal justice. It's almost like an oxymoron. And who are the real criminals, and who's really getting the justice? And so, I mean, it's great that we come and talk about these situations and kind of get some clarity, so that as a group organization we can actually address it. I guess with some.
But realize too, I mean, part of what I want to hopefully give you the message of is there's people that are doing this, right? So I've been fortunate to be in the positions I've been in where I can gain the trust of practitioners and policymakers, that I'm not here to smear them in a political campaign. I'm not here to try to make people look bad. What can I do using my skills and my experience to help advance and improve the system through empirical evidence? So, my opportunity to serve on the commission, I saw this is my chance, right? I've been doing the work diligently for 30 years, and I was given an opportunity to be on a commission where, what are your ideas on how we can improve the system? And it was my opportunity to say, okay, in the 30 years of work I've done, here are the issues that we need to address from the research. And so there's a lot of people that are doing that. The issue about this domestic violence stuff is work we're doing right now to better understand the impact it has. But really our goal is, what's the best response to domestic violence? And if the best response is that there's mandatory treatment as opposed to mandatory revocation, aren't we better off? I understand why the policy was created. The policy was created because a parolee was arrested for violating an order of protection, and while that case was pending, he committed a murder against the person. And there was an outcry that this parolee should have been sent back to prison when he violated the order of protection. We shouldn't have had to wait for the murder to occur. And it was done in a political reaction, and it was done quickly. Within 2 months, a new law was passed.
Exactly.
Right?
And see, I think that's that knee-jerk reaction where we just changed the whole policy for everybody that's involved.
Right. But again, it gets to an electorate and a public that thinks that's the right solution. A group like this that realizes, is that really going to fix things? Isn't the norm, right? The norm is, okay, the law's been passed, we're all safer, and everything's good now. Granted, our tax rates going up because the prison population's going up, and higher education in Illinois has to take a cut because we got to pay for the prison. So in the end, are we really that much better off?
Okay, I think that, our time is coming up. I wanted to give, before we break, Finley a chance to introduce our guest and talk a little bit about justice in Afghanistan.